I think we have quorum here, so everybody's on time. Amazing. So, okay, so I'm delighted to introduce today. Uh, I can never pronounce your last name.
Fine, I'll take any Corshane, but yeah.
Corshane, Laura Corshane. Okay, I never can. Okay, who's doing a postdoc here? She's came here from Oxford.
Mhm.
And she's going to talk about Twitter and Taliban and the Taliban. And I remember reading about Taliban.com in 1999. They established themselves in 98 or something like
Mhm.
that online. And it blew my mind that the Taliban had a website. Anyway, take it away.
Thanks so much, Herb. Yeah, so I'm going to chat with you all today about sort of some results from a joint report that I put out with some colleagues with the Center for Artificial Intelligence, Data, and Conflict. It's a center I co-found and co-direct, as well as some new results and data from a forthcoming sort of academic piece that we're submitting. And essentially, it looks at how the Taliban used Twitter during the takeover period in summer of 2021. So this is sort of a brief overview of the data set. We started by identifying 63 Twitter accounts of key members of Taliban leadership, sort of public spokespersons, and avowed members. For the time period of April 1st, which was about 2 weeks prior to US President Biden's announcement of US troop withdrawal on April 14th through September 16th of 2021, which is about a month after the takeover. These 63 accounts produced over 112,000 tweets. And by September, they had amassed over 2 million followers on Twitter. All of this content was also amplified. And by amplification, I mean sort of retweeted or liked by sort of a consistent ecosystem of accounts of around 126,000 Twitter accounts. So sort of, I want to provide you a bit of context on sort of the history of the Taliban's use of technology, and particularly online operations. As Herb sort of astutely pointed out, the Taliban actually created their first website in 1998. This was during a period in Afghanistan where the average Afghan didn't have access to sort of phone lines, let alone internet. And so for senior Taliban leadership, this was very much about promoting an image online that was very oriented towards the international community. Fast forwarding post sort of US operations and sort of Taliban retreat into Pakistan, by 2005, sort of in the midst of a lot of foreign investment into Afghanistan around information communication technology and this desire to help sort of promote development within Afghanistan, especially around sort of phone line infrastructure, the Taliban sort of sought to kind of weaponize this new information environment. And so they launched a new website in 2005. It was Al-Amara, iterations of Al-Amara. Sort of an Al-Amara is in reference to the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the Emirate, sort of their government that they then reestablished in 2021. They also sort of began to produce pretty high quality videos, in part aided by the fact that they had access to Al-Qaeda's media studio when they were in Pakistan. And a lot of these videos were being spread throughout Afghanistan using cell phones. By 2009, they were trying to establish these online Mujahideen support groups. Oftentimes we think of sort of Russia as having kind of pioneered this idea of troll farms. And in reality, sort of the Taliban back in 2009 were thinking about the value of having other accounts or a supportive ecosystem to sort of push out their narrative and to counter what they termed Western disinformation. By 2011, that's sort of when they're first spotted on Twitter. There's sort of a very notable and public exchange where they accused a NATO official of having a mistress. And sort of there was this back and forth between the NATO accounts and the Taliban accounts. And then through sort of over the last 10 years, they've kind of continued to sort of expand their presence online and on different platforms. They joined WhatsApp and Telegram in 2015, and they even tried to launch a Pashto language app, but that was sort of subsequently removed within the same day from the App Store. So high level, sort of my key claim and sort of what I hope to kind of demonstrate is that during the takeover period, the Taliban invested considerable time and organizational resources to develop and amplify a sophisticated and coordinated information campaign in real time. Much of this effort was on social media, and the Taliban publicly stated their preference for Twitter. Twitter as a platform is quite important because Twitter was the only sort of big Western platform that stated that they wouldn't implement a blanket ban on Taliban accounts. They stated that if the Taliban violated their terms of service around the promotion or glorification of violence, they would then remove that content. And if there were repeated offenses, they would then sort of move to remove the accounts. By contrast, Facebook and YouTube and Google all sort of had made blanket bans and targeted measures. And so the Taliban publicly stated that they sort of saw this and decided to kind of invest more intensively in Twitter. So sort of my first point, high level, is that they recognized the value of social media long before the takeover, to sort of underscore this idea that basically it wasn't just they developed a set of accounts in 2021, specifically for the takeover period in 2020, which is around when the Taliban, basically they're affiliated with the Haqqani network, and the New York Times published an op-ed by a high-level Haqqani network leader, and they began to promote it on Twitter, and they saw that they were getting a lot of sort of attention and engagement on Twitter. And so a member of the Taliban social media team publicly stated that that's sort of when they realized the power of Twitter as a platform. And so that's sort of represented in our data set of these core accounts. A huge majority of the accounts were created in 2020, sort of aligning or correlating with that sort of that inflection point where they saw they weren't getting much traction on Twitter, and their op-ed piece was getting a ton of attention on Twitter. So what did their influence operations practically look like? Here I have sort of a subset of the core accounts, just to highlight sort of how in the open they were on Twitter. They often had, as you can see, sort of on this side, they had the emblem of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in both the banner and the profile picture. This particular account talks about how he's a journalist of the hashtag Taliban in English. And he has a link to Alamara and Pashto, so that's the Pashto language version of the official Taliban website. And then you have sort of on this, a member of sort of the Haqqani network, who I'll mention later because he's relevant, but sort of he's a prominent figure within the Haqqani network and has been on sort of US watch lists. So just again, high level, for those of you that aren't familiar with sort of the takeover, Taliban began their significant military operations in May. They launched a major offensive in Helmand province. By June, sort of operations were continuing to escalate. In July, the US forces left Bagram Air Base, and the Taliban kind of continued their offensive across different provinces. And by August, early August is when they sort of took major provincial capitals, and then they took Kabul on August 15th. So linking back to our data set, sort of this is high level, sort of the volume of tweets by week during the sort of, again, summer months and beginning early April. And so you see, as highlighted in sort of with the red bubble, the week with the highest tweet production links up with August 15th when they took Kabul, which intuitively makes sense. That's sort of when they were sharing the most amount of sort of information about their activities and their offensives. In the next few slides, I'll sort of walk through examples of tweets that highlight key narratives within sort of their information campaign. A first sort of subset or a bit high level narrative that we continued to see among the tweets that they were pushing out was the amplification of civilian deaths and sort of accusing opponents of war crimes. So they would often sort of put tag it with the hashtag war crime, and they would talk about sort of enemies targeting hospitals, the mercenary enemy killing civilians. And then this account sort of on the far side of the screen, he basically was I think an Australian civilian that was kidnapped and sort of radicalized during his kidnapping with the Taliban, and he became one of the chief English language propagandists online for the Taliban during this period. So he, in particular, a lot of what he tweeted out during this period was sort of critiques of the West. And so in that tweet, he's accusing the US of firing on Afghans, and he's tagging the UN and Amnesty International and POTUS in the tweet. Another huge narrative was sort of highlighting and encouraging the defection of Afghan soldiers. We haven't gotten into this yet, but I think sort of an interesting way to try and measure real world effects of social media would be to see how much this targeted set of or this targeted narrative was in sort of encouraging soldiers to defect. So they were basically reiterating that if soldiers, Afghan National Security Forces soldiers were to defect, that the Islamic Emirate would welcome them with open arms, and that they would face no penalties for joining the Taliban, despite their sort of history working for Afghan forces. They also often publicized meetings with foreign governments and the UN. So these two tweets, the first sort of talks about a meeting with a delegation from Russia. And part of this, we think, is about sort of presenting themselves as a government in waiting and highlighting their capacities as a potential governing force. And the other is about sort of specifically naming a UN official and sort of presenting themselves as amenable to discussions with the UN, or that the UN in some ways sort of highlighting that the UN tacitly endorses sort of them as a group or their efforts. And that was in early July. We also saw oftentimes that they would basically, they had this, and I'll talk about this in later slides, this approach of tweeting out narratives before they took a city, while they took the city, and then the aftermath. This sort of highlights the aftermath, is that they would put out images presenting utopian vision of life under Taliban control. This often included, for example, sending out those so-called Taliban journalists out into the street after they took a particular city with microphones that had the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan sort of emblazoned on them, and asking folks, how do you feel now that the Taliban has liberated you and taken over the city, and then pushing out that as sort of a piece of propaganda. There was also, I think, a video in September showing them giving out sort of wads of cash to children that they said were sort of orphaned by the conflict, and highlighting how they were sort of giving back to the community in that way. They also sort of like to kind of appropriate some of the terminology around disinformation and fake news. There was a tweet in particular where the Taliban directly mentioned at Twitter and at Jack Dorsey, you need to be amplifying our content more because we're highlighting the truth of what's happening in Afghanistan, and we're pushing back against Western disinformation and fake news. So very much, again, appropriating this sort of this Western discussion around the importance of content moderation and fact checking to serve their own sort of narrative and agenda. This slide sort of highlights high level the hashtags they were using. So they often use this to sort of like link together, again, all those different types of tweets around a similar narrative. So the most frequent one was Al-Fath, and it's a Pashto word that means victory, and it was sort of previously used back in 2019 around a specific offensive, and we think they brought it back to highlight particular military engagements during the takeover period. They also sort of some of the top three underneath all refer to sort of the war crimes piece that I highlighted, the hashtag Kabul regime crimes and hashtag Helmand massacre. This third one, WLC2 deceive soldier, is all about encouraging defections. And yeah, hashtag life under control of the Taliban. So again, these were all sort of tools to amplify some of their messaging and serve to kind of highlight some of the key narratives that they were pushing out during this period. I mentioned sort of briefly the idea of like that they tagged other users in a lot of their posts. Some of these are just other members of leadership within the Taliban organization, but others are specifically news organizations. So you can see that they tagged Al Jazeera and Tolo News, and CNN is lower on the list, but was tagged often. And then I think important to highlight is Human Rights Watch was among sort of the most frequently mentioned accounts. And again, I think serves to kind of underscore their attempt to present themselves as highlighting or fighting against supposed sort of war crimes committed by the Afghan government. So my second point is that the Taliban were not shouting into the void, and that an active community existed around them that was amplifying the spread of their messaging. So this sort of just highlights the high-level engagement statistics by the Taliban, and then beneath that, we aggregated the tweets of the top 18 Afghan news organizations on Twitter during that same period to try and measure, compare, like what were sort of the comparable engagement metrics. And as you can see, sort of the Taliban received over sort of 3 times as many likes and retweets and replies on their content. So at least in terms of the battle for the Afghan information space on Twitter, the Taliban were receiving considerable more engagement than the types of organizations that we would have liked to see. This also sort of highlights daily engagement with Taliban linked tweets during that same period. Probably predictably, the peak is during that sort of the week they took over Kabul. But I think it's also important to highlight that sort of in the weeks afterwards, the average daily engagement increased. I think the most likely explanation for this, there were basically a lot of claims that the Taliban were trying to monitor the social media accounts of Afghans online. And so in response, a lot of Afghans deleted their social media. And then conversely, it's likely that people were trying to, either supporters came out of the woodwork and then were more openly supporting them, or maybe Afghans used social media to just sort of like tweets as sort of a signal that, that the regime shouldn't come after them. This is similarly, this is about mentions. So that's basically outside of the accounts that were directly engaging with them, who was sort of tagging the 63 core accounts in posts they were making. And we see similar trends of just a general uptick through August 15th, and then a higher average in the month after the takeover. My third point is that I think sort of relates to an earlier idea that I mentioned, that basically that the Taliban throughout the takeover period were prolifically posting online, and they were in fact sort of live streaming as they took city to city. We sort of investigated within the data set how they were mentioning specific locations and provinces and how that matched up to what was happening on the ground in the sort of the physical battle space. These are just brief examples of tweets that sort of mention specific locations and how they sort of use that to push particular messages about, again, the inevitability of their success. So this is just a high-level count of all the 34 provinces. I'll also note that there's a screenshot on this slide from this account that basically proclaimed to kind of, they had like hourly like insider videos of Taliban activities in English. So this is just a highlight. We thought this was sort of an interesting thing to investigate because, again, there was sort of heterogeneity in the intensity of conflict across different provinces of Afghanistan. And so we were curious to whether or not that sort of related to changes in discussion over time during that same period. So I'll highlight here, this is an overview of sort of daily discussion of Helmand province. So the 2 peaks, the first is in early May, which, as I mentioned sort of earlier in the presentation, they had a major offensive in Helmand province during that same period. So that sort of reflected also in their online activity. And then they have their other peak in blue, circled in blue, in early August, which is when sort of they were approaching the provincial capital of Lashkargah and took it. And so in the aftermath of that, there's a lot less discussion of the province. And you can see it sort of petered off with that circle in red. That's when they took, that's when the Taliban took Kabul, and there really wasn't much discussion of Helmand province after that. This is the same for Kandahar, to just sort of show a contrast and reflecting sort of differences between the 2 provinces. The bulk of the fighting in Kandahar was happening in early July. Part of that is because at the time they sort of were at the gates of Kandahar city. And that would have been the first kind of provincial capital that they would have taken had they taken it at that time. So there was a lot of discussion about it within these accounts online. And then they finally succeeded in taking it just before the August 15th date that's circled there in red. My last point is that the Taliban retain a sophisticated presence in the online information space. Um, so this is also linked to the report. We found evidence that at the time, and some of this is still reflected in the updates that we've made about the accounts, is that a lot of the Taliban accounts qualified for sponsored ads. So they were deemed by Twitter to basically meet the criteria for both the type of account and the type of audience that these ads should be placed with. So you can see that the Haqqani account has M&Ms, and then Disney Plus on another account. And then sort of on this this furthest side, we were curious about this because especially that account we were scrolling through it and there was a lot of really graphic images that were not taken down by the account. And so eventually it got a flag. So if you went to that account, you would be sort of prompted with this caution: this profile might include sensitive content, but when you click through it, there would still be ads there. So in this case, Kelly Clarkson show. So, I mean, we reached out to Twitter at the time, happy to chat more about sort of this and implications of this for sort of how content moderation policies for platforms. But needless to say, this was about, I think, this is about a third of the Taliban accounts ended up having sponsored ads on them. In 2023, the Taliban bought blue check marks. That was quickly removed, partly because the BBC ran a story about it, and then I think Twitter responded and reacted accordingly. Although I will say in the aftermath of that, I double checked within our core accounts, and I think there were still one or two that may have been missed in that effort. So there's sort of this continued, and they thanked, I think there was a quote sort of thanking Elon for their ability to do this. They're also sort of now using it, now that they've sort of moved away from their fight during the 2021 takeover, they're using social media for other sort of operations. So they launched recently this Twitter account that's basically about countering propaganda from Islamic State Khorasan province, as well as an associated website. So I think it'll be interesting to see over the next year sort of how they engage with Islamic State online and whether they're successful, or like sort of the comparative success of the two and how that's reflected in recruitment on the ground. They're also doing ongoing monitoring. I just thought this was funny because I gave a talk about this last week, and they found a tweet that was made about some of the content. So the forum basically used a quote from me that was talking about that they're good at information control. And the Taliban Public Relations Department responded by saying that they were very astute observations. So I got the endorsement of that this is an accurate assessment. So preempting any criticism. Yeah, and again, this account in 2023 has around 27,000 followers and sort of linking directly to their sort of a newly rebranded Alamara website. I also want to sort of end on the note that, like, I think it's important that the Taliban's proliferation is not necessarily unique, and that there's a range of armed groups that sort of are beyond the purview of sort of how a lot of platforms are thinking about content moderation policy, or sort of where they're investing efforts, particularly so now that there have been a lot of like layoffs in Silicon Valley. So sort of highlighted here, I think early in the conflict in Ukraine, there was a lot of TikTok accounts associated with the Azov battalion. There's a Twitter account there from a commander of a group in Mali. Drug cartels have been sort of pretty prolific on TikTok. And then in the far corner, that's a piece of propaganda. I think it's either Al-Shabaab or Islamic State, but it was written in an East African language. And so it stayed on the platform for longer. So I think there's a lot of implications for whether or not these companies are investing resources and time and energy in the languages of sort of countries and conflicts beyond what's immediately of importance to the West. Yeah, and I want to end on these sort of final takeaways. I think I just underscored this point. Beyond Russia and China and the Islamic State, there's a range of actors that are developing capacities for waging influence operations. I think it's important that there be more research on this topic. The second is that there was basically, I think, a massive missed opportunity on the part of the US to develop some kind of strategy or counter-information response. A lot of these accounts were sort of left to their own devices. There didn't seem to be much like fact-checking, for example, or any kind of counter-narratives that were pushed out at the same scale during the same period to counteract the potential effectiveness of this campaign. And then the last point is that sort of, especially to sort of underscore that what I highlighted around the live streaming as they move from city to city and province to province. Social media data has a lot of potential insights for scholars trying to study sort of active conflict settings. And we're seeing similar trends around like sort of live streaming from the battlefield in Ukraine. And so I think it's important to sort of invest, as a scholarly space, sort of invest time and energy investigating those pieces. Thank you so much.
Okay, consistent with tradition, fellows get the first crack at Laura, and so state your name, please.
I'm Naomi Eagle. I'm a postdoc fellow here at CSAC. Thanks so much, Laura. This was a fascinating presentation and has raised many, many questions in my head. So I'll ask you one. I wondered if you could say more about sort of, I guess, who is the intended audience, and more broadly, sort of what success on Twitter would look like for the Taliban. You know, I noticed that at one point you showed some tweets that were in Pashto, not in English. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about maybe also talking about the followers and the amplification and sort of who that's directed at, and then in that context, maybe how successful that was. So sure. Sorry, I packed like 4 questions into one, but you can answer whatever you like.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, I think on intended audience, it was interesting because I think Twitter generally isn't really used by Afghans. So like their decision to really invest in that as the main platform, it seemed like, was a bit at odds. And I think partly it reflected, again, platform policy. They were just facing a lot more kind of targeted removals on Facebook in particular. So within our data set of 112,000 tweets, about 90% are in sort of more local languages, Pashto, Dari, and Urdu. Only 10% are in English. So I do think it, like, the intended audience is likely based on like language as a proxy. English language is probably for international community, while the remainder are more local communities. It's probably either sort of like supporters more, and then maybe Afghans that are on Twitter. But to your point about success, it's unclear to me, given those constraints of how few Afghans were on Twitter, whether or not that actually sort of directly kind of shaped perceptions. But it was clearly, at least within the ecosystem of supporters and and folks that were online, fairly successful in proliferating. Yeah. That's it.
One more fellow question down there, and then 2 more fellow questions. Okay, go ahead.
This is Luis Rodriguez. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at CSAC. Thank you for the presentation, Laura. As Naomi, I have a lot of questions. I'm going to pose one, though. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about the infrastructure prerequisites of this story, because at the end of the day, this is also a story happening in a conflict-driven setting, and I'm guessing that it might be difficult to get access to servers, routers, access to internet, especially if they are live streaming their movements from city to city. So my question is, like, how do they do this, physically speaking? Like, what is the infrastructure behind these capabilities?
That's a great question. I think like the true answer could only, I'll give sort of half an answer because I think there's like an approximation of it. I know, like, from an organizational standpoint, they began really investing and having sort of individuals have cell phones, and also I think district level commanders and above, starting in 2005, all had like laptops. So they were really investing in sort of like the hardware associated with how you carry this out. I think a big piece is that they're oftentimes relying on the same infrastructure that civilians are. And so that's the inherent challenge with ICT, is that they're sort of shared infrastructure. So if you want to sort of remove that, it's not there. And I think I mentioned early in the presentation that I think they got some training from Al-Qaeda, especially like the media wing in the early stages. And so they had access to like video quarters and editing software that they sort of took from that media production unit from Al-Qaeda.
Julie, you're on.
Hi, I'm Julie George. I'm a pre-doctoral fellow here at CSAC and at the Institute for Human-Centered AI. Thanks so much, Laura, for this great presentation. I think it's so impressive with the amount of data that you've been able to compile and then analyze and synthesize. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the level of tweets and about potentially sentiment analysis. In one of your slides, you had mentioned that they're trying to portray a utopian vision of this city to city takeover. And so I'm wondering, did you see more positive type of sentiments versus negative sentiments or other types of emotions?
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question. I think it's tough. I think that requires a little bit more like digging at scale with the data set. But I think to your point, I think a lot of it is sort of, it seemed to be oriented around the idea of, again, presenting themselves as like the future government. So while they did have tweets that were about sort of attacking their opponent, a lot of it was sort of about like even presenting like pseudo unification. Even I think on one of the slides with the Taliban PR department that sort of responded, the profile description is talking about like unifying Afghans. So I think largely sort of positive with the exception of like attacks that they made against their opponent. And I think it was all about sort of trying to bring Afghans to their side with the yeah.
Alan.
Thanks, Laura. What a fantastic talk. Learned so much. I'm Alan Weiner from the law school. I'm starting to dabble in this area a little bit. On Julie's question, one thing maybe you could do is search for emojis. Emojis are on my mind right now because my daughter has been driving my car and she announced to me that some of the emojis on the dashboard were on, which kind of freaked me out a little bit. The emojis on the dashboard. Two questions. One, with those retweets, again, I'm interested in this question about like who was influencing whom. On the retweets, do you have any sense of who was doing the retweeting, right? In other words, is this for another way of thinking about the question of, is this directed at the audience of people in Afghanistan, or is it people outside talking to people outside? And then question two, I'm a little curious about this policy recommendation about the US should develop counter responses in the case of the Taliban. I mean, I don't know what that means. For like 20 years, wasn't the US engaged in like a pretty aggressive, messaging campaign about how bad the Taliban was? Like what more would they have done? Like go after individual accounts on Twitter? I'm wondering, what that recommendation looks like if it were fleshed out. Thanks.
For sure. Yeah, I love your suggestion of the emojis piece. On who was retweeting, I think there was some sort of we basically looked at the top 3 tweets that were sort of the most liked and most engaged with. And that we saw sort of a break outside the bubble that I think was existing for a lot of these tweets. And the top 3 tweets happened to be just basically more vague misogynistic tweets, to be frank. They were sort of talking about the subjugation of women in broader terms, not just specifically Afghan women. And we think it got basically broader pickup within like sort of the community, and it was in English, of sort of like all Andrew Tate-esque supporters abroad. Yeah, the incel gang. Actually, interestingly, there was basically some Andrew Tate supporters claim that Taliban members joined a Twitter space, so like a live event in support of Andrew Tate's release recently. So sort of like, again, the idea of there were certain narratives that I think got co-opted by other groups outside of like the immediate sort of bubble of Taliban supporters in the Afghan. I would say that a lot of the retweets were about other support accounts. And so it was like an amplification technique of like, we're going to retweet one another. And hopefully that's how we bolster engagement that way. But I think it's a hard question of like actually how successful this was in changing the minds or perceptions of the average Afghan. On the US counter response piece, I think largely a lot of like US propaganda in Afghanistan, frankly, over the course of 20 years wasn't very successful, largely because it wasn't tailored to the context and the culture. And I think there were many iterations of trying to improve upon that, but it was really hard. In this specific instance, I'm sort of talking about the potential opportunity of, for example, Twitter had ad space on that they were placing sponsored ad on the Taliban accounts. Could that same space have been used to sort of like promote different information? Or if Twitter as a company decided, okay, fine, where we're going to draw the red line is not about who the accounts belong to, but rather the content, why aren't they fact checking those accounts? Because there were a lot of sort of pieces of disinformation. Why aren't they more heavily moderating those accounts? And why not that as sort of as an approach of like a US based company? So again, the specific like implementation of whether it's the US sort of suggesting to Twitter to do something or the US themselves, especially the Haqqani network accounts. The Haqqani network is still on sort of the terrorist watch list. I don't know legally, so I would love your take on this, how it was permissible for a US based company to allow them to sort of provide those individuals in that organization with like a platform and to use a US sort of tool to forward an organizational aim.
I don't think it's fair to ask the question. That's a really great.
Yeah.
Okay, Carol.
Great. Laura, terrific talk. Really learned a lot. And I'm thinking back to some of the work that Herb and I have done on disinformation, and more specifically, a colleague, Kate Starbird, who's done sort of mapping of tweeting and retweeting and looking at sort of the views or the ideologies of the people conducting the tweet. Because one of the observations is it's you put messaging out there, but who picks it up and retweets it is not necessarily who you think will retweet it. And I'm wondering whether you have any views on this in the case of the Taliban. What is this connecting to? Who's picking this up and retweeting it? Are there any particular views of the kinds of people who are doing it? I know in Kate's work on NATO, for example, and Russian disinformation campaigns against NATO, there's sort of like the international left and the populist right tend to pick up the same messages and retweet each other, which was kind of a surprising finding when she put out an article on this a few years ago. And I'm just wondering, like, what does that ecosystem look like in terms of their views and ideas and points of view or ideology?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. I think regrettably we didn't get to sort of do some of the nitty gritty around the 126,000 of repeatedly amplifying. I think from sort of like anecdotally looking through who was liking it, a lot of them are sort of, again, like Taliban support, that they'll include in their account bio that they're a Taliban supporter. So it wasn't necessarily clear that it was like a conversion was happening. It was sort of this ecosystem that already exists that maybe they built upon a little bit. And I think it's just sort of related to sort of my earlier response too, there was some degree of sort of external, like I think appropriation by some of these more misogynist incel-like groups. But I think that's a really great kind of point in question, that digging into the amplifying ecosystem a little bit more to try and figure out politically where they're aligned and who they represent is great.
I'm going to insert myself into the queue here. You've described, everybody says this is a great talk. I think it's a great talk too. You described what seems to me to be a very successful operation in the social media and so on. And I was wondering if you'd care to, it's sort of built on Alan's point. Is there anything that the United States could learn about how to run a social media campaign from the Taliban?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the sort of responsiveness was a really interesting piece for me, that I think just both I have suggestions, I think broadly for other like IGOs, for example, like the UN tweet that I put up around in the immediate aftermath of the meeting they had with the UN official, they turned to social media. They put out that they met with this specific individual, and this was sort of their understanding of the meeting that sort of dictates the narrative for everyone around their notions, whether true or not, of the UN's positioning vis-a-vis the Taliban. And I think there's something to be learned there about the responsiveness, because I think a lot of these bureaucracies, in terms of like how they, especially in active conflict settings where things are changing constantly, the benefit that these groups have is sort of that, at least the Taliban, it seemed that their effort on some issues, there was a centralization. A chief spokesperson account would put out a statement, and that would then be retweeted by other sort of members of that network that were sort of lower on the rung. But then for more kind of emerging issues, they were able to just sort of, as independent actors, tweet out anything that was sort of beneficial for the organization. And I think there's something about that, responsiveness and rapidity of how you sort of put out information with evolving situations, as much as there's, again, drawbacks to it, that just needs to be understood, especially if you want to get ahead or sort of set the terms of what the narrative is about a particular event.
So that suggests that if we dispense with centralized control on high-level approvals for low-level tweets and such, we would do a lot better.
Yes, with certain, like, I think evolving situations, yes. Or if there's like terms, I think setting aside, like if the event doesn't sort of meet certain threshold, then like you can use their discretion. PR officials could use their discretion around
Okay,
publishing.
thank you.
Yeah.
Over here.
Steve Stedman, Senior Fellow at CDDRL. Can you talk about, like, sort of big picture, what does this all add up to, right? And I'll give you sort of two extremes. One is you're going to make a case that in the absence of having, a sophisticated social media strategy, the Taliban would not be where they are today, right? That's one extreme. To the other extreme being, there used to be a sociologist here who often came to CSAC events named John Meyer. And one of his things was with globalization, what you see is an enormous amount of institutional mimicry. And you see organizations and institutions doing things because that's like, if you are a rebel group, you have to have a social media strategy. It doesn't mean it's important, it's you got to have one, right? Just like, in the 1960s, every African country had to have a National Academy of Sciences, even though some countries only had like 6 scientists, right? So the point being that it's very performative, and it shows something, has something about, if you're going to do this, you're going to have it. But in terms of influence, it's really pretty minor. So
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's right. I think I can't make sort of a causational claim about the impact of social media, largely because the state of the research on sort of the effects of influence operations is still quite nascent. Like, we're still trying to tease out, for example, what was sort of the direct effect of Russian influence operations on the election in terms of tangible behavioral changes or changes in beliefs or changes in perception. That's still very like an ongoing kind of question around the nature of these types of operations. I'll say that I think that there's like, using this data set, what has come to mind for me is like, what are interesting ways that we could tease out impact? So I think I highlighted this during the presentation, but to me, because they invested, one of the narratives was about promoting defection, and they even had pieces of disinformation where they would put out images of individuals that they claimed to have defected from the Afghan National Security Forces, and they were false images. But whether or not that actually affected anyone's perception of whether they should defect or not, I think that could be the one interesting thing to measure. Or similarly, there was this sort of sentiment that anecdotally from folks I've spoken to that were on the ground during the takeover period of like the inevitability, how much of that sense of inevitability is sort of linked in part to the fact that they were scrolling on their phones and seeing this information versus just what they were feeling from being on the ground. But yeah, it's a great point. The only real assertion I can make is that there was a perceived importance by the Taliban to invest these kinds of resources. I think sort of time and more research is needed to discern actual like impact and success or effectiveness.
Going to go to one online question from Martha Henshaw. Thanks, Laura. Recommendations for effective counter messaging strategy.
Yeah, I think so. I think I would sort of underscore what I mentioned earlier to Herb about the idea of sort of having more agile like units that can more directly respond. So if you're an institution like the UN and you see that a group like the Taliban, in the aftermath of meeting with them, is immediately taking to Twitter and saying this is how the meeting went and how great for us as a group, that you need to be able to respond to that without sort of having to go through the normal bureaucracy in some ways, even if it's like a placeholder tweet and then saying more information will come. There needs to be sort of an agility. I think the other piece too is, in this case, again, these are Western owned companies, and sort of trying to understand the rationale around why you would permit a particular group, either, again, Haqqani Network is directly kind of linked to Taliban, or the Taliban, either of the two, on the platform. I think shutting them down could have been pretty effective. Again, it was effective at sort of quashing. I think in theory, an argument could be made that they might have had an even more effective campaign had Facebook implemented similar policies to Twitter. So something about sort of partnering with these companies, especially around, this is coming. U.S. President Biden announced on April 14th, they had some sort of leeway up to sort of troop withdrawal time, knowing that should there be any kind of plan around, the Taliban are probably going to be using, propaganda as they have in many other forms, not just using social media as a technology, but, through pamphlets since the beginning of the war. How are they going to use propaganda during this time period? And can we have, any kind of response to that?
Hi, Laura. It was a wonderful presentation, as
You
everyone else.
are.
I'll get to it. Sorry. My name is Elijah Scott. I'm a PhD student in political science. It's a wonderful presentation, like everyone has said. I wanted, one thing I was thinking during this presentation, and you touched on this a decent amount, is how this relates to the state building literature. Because I think this almost seems like a formerly non-state actor engaging in things like state building, and especially as you talk about other non-state actors around the world, I'm wondering how you can relate this to the state building literature more generally, and how you see this kind of changing when it's applied to other groups that are currently non-state actors that might like to someday be state actors.
Yeah, that's a great question. So separate research that me and some colleagues have done on how rebel groups in Syria and Libya have used Facebook in particular. So I think directly speaks to that. We found like that especially during COVID, so they would use Facebook pages actually to highlight different governance functions that they provided to local populations under their control. So there was one group, for example, I believe it was in Libya, that had 18 different Facebook pages, and each of them was sort of dedicated to a core governance function. So they had one Facebook page that was all about COVID cases in the area under their control, and sort of their monitoring of it and updating people on sort of cases and encouraging people to wear masks. And then others were all about sort of the judiciary that they had and upcoming cases and how they were litigating that. So I would say that there is sort of evidence that a lot of these groups use social media as sort of a tool to promote the fact that they provide these services to the community, and it's a way of communicating to the community. They're sort of the positives of life under their control. So that's a great question. Yeah.
Hi. Hi, my name is Mel. I'm a biosecurity fellow here at CSAC. Thank you for the presentation, Laura. It's surreal almost. But my question is, could you talk a little bit about the extent to which the international contestation and or variance and recognition of the Taliban's international legal status has an effect or matters or is significant for the kinds of preemptive counter strategies that the U.S. might imagine undertaking?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think so. A lot of this is sort of pre their official status as a state. So my argument, a lot of it sort of, I get to, find a way out of sort of responding directly to that with sort of the early phases of saying that there should have been a strategy up to that point, or that the Taliban, the Haqqani network, up until August 15th were not an official state. So why was it that Twitter, for example, allowed them on the platform, and what was the rationale for that? I think in the aftermath, as much as they like retained official status, which I think was a lot of this sort of post hoc justification that Twitter had for saying it's acceptable that they're on the platform, was really linked to this idea of like they're a state, so therefore they should have all the same rights that a state does on our platform, and be permitted to continue. I think there's still sort of approaches that can be taken. One, this has been done with Russia, China, but you could sort of directly identify the account as sort of state media, or just include some other label, or again, apply fact-checking labels just as you would to any other state government official that's putting out pieces of information about it, if you want to sort of treat them as a state. But that's, yeah, I think a great question around sort of the intricacies of, now that they're a state, are there sort of different responses? I think in some ways the US response now has to either go through the platform, or it has to go through more official channels. I think before that August 15th sort of change point, they could have, taken more covert actions. I mean, some might argue, I think still today, that they can take more kind of covert or direct actions, but yeah.
Harold, round two.
Thanks. Abusing maybe my privilege as deputy director. Just one comment on the state building question, which I think is a really interesting one. The examples you gave were related to sort of vertical legitimacy. I'd also encourage you to look at horizontal legitimacy, building that kind of state-like profile with other actors that are states or important NGOs or IGOs that might be, they're trying to build a certain reputation. Maybe Taliban is not the best case, but you can imagine many other rebel groups that might be thinking about things that way. But it was interesting your point you were making about having a much more agile media presence and pushing down the ability to push out information about what's going on as a way of sort of counter messaging. That made me think of some of the concerns that people have about that kind of very quick ability for lower level, officials or troops to post, which is using OSINT type information to identify where units are in the field and target them, which we've seen in sort of the Ukraine-Russia war, um, being very adept. Troops leave their cell phones on, they take pictures, they get posted, they're shared back. Next thing you know, the end of that. And so I just wondering, A, to what extent was Taliban rapidly pushing out information about where they were sort of live streaming actually may used against them in this way by coalition or the opposing forces, and maybe this isn't a good case for that, and whether that might be a concern that the U.S. might have about pushing down its ability for people to respond very quickly on the ground might actually have some other security concerns.
Great. Yeah, I think your point about sort of horizontal liaising with other governments is super important. I think we saw some of that there. I had looked through the data set to see how they talked about Russia, China, for example, during the takeover. And I know they had sent, in the midst of the takeover period, they'd also sent an envoy to China. And I was curious whether or not they capitalized on that. And there really wasn't much evidence, but I think looking at sort of their social media activity post takeover and seeing how that's maybe shifted or changed would be super interesting. On the OSINT piece, I didn't see much evidence. I think part of it is because coalition forces were largely on their way out. And so what normally could have been an interesting opportunity wasn't. I've had some conversations with individuals in government that talked about looking at social media feeds and seeing this information. But I think from what they shared, it's hard to slot in with current sort of intelligence systems. It's just not viewed as, necessarily as credible. And so given that, I think there's just currently sort of a debacle internally around how do you, if a group is highlighting their location, how do you consider that as intelligence? Do you think it's accurate? Do you think it's, are they lying about it? Is it an intentional piece of disinformation? So oftentimes that needs to be co-corroborated. But yeah, I haven't seen too much information in this specific case about how it was leveraged.
I got another question and then another one over here. You talked a little bit about how much engagement Taliban tweets gotten and so on. And I was wondering if there was any way of differentiating between sort of engagement within, what fraction of those engagements were already within a pro-Taliban, Taliban supportive group versus outside of that? Do you have any way of coming up with that?
I think there's a way to quantify it. I think unfortunately, we haven't like applied tools to it, but I definitely think, because I think other folks have raised sort of similar points about like how much were they able to actually break out of this like immediate support in the ecosystem and like convert folks to their perspective, at least in the online.
Not necessarily converting folks.
Yeah.
It's just breaking it, but it's a breaking out outside of it.
Yeah.
Do you have any intuition as to what that, if you were to do that analysis, what that number would be?
I feel uncomfortable necessarily giving a number without doing the analysis. My hunch would be just like looking at sort of the 100, because it was 126,000 accounts, right, that a good percentage, like a substantive percentage, I think were pre-existing supporters. But I do, I can't speak directly to that, unfortunately, Herb, but I think that's a great next step for the project.
Okay, over here.
I don't want Harold to feel bad asking two questions. So.
I also asked two questions.
There you go. So, I was trying to think about whether the social media of a rebel group actually reflects like coherent strategy and coherent messaging. And in some ways, this would suggest that they do, like in this period of takeover, right? There are a number of themes that they're hitting that seem to be fairly important. One that I would think would be interesting for an outside audience, right? If they're at all concerned about an outside audience, what was the great concern for international actors, United States, et cetera, NGOs, was women? How are they going to treat women? So are they trying, is there anything in their messaging that suggests they're going to be something other than the Taliban when it comes to how they're going to treat women? And then secondly is going back, if you could, have you looked at all like when the Taliban enters into like the track 2 negotiations in the Gulf? What are they trying to use social media to like tell their supporters it's okay, we can, we're willing to cooperate, we're willing to compromise, or this is just a charade? What are the messages that they're sending out when they're in the midst of a negotiation, where they have to appear like they're sincere actors willing to compromise?
Yeah, two really great questions. On the piece about women, so we found sort of anecdotally, and I think we want to go back and measure it, that there was a very negative sort of the way they spoke about women during the takeover period was in line with sort of our understanding of their ideology, which is quite negative. Then I think they noticed because they're basically in the August through September period, there were a lot of think pieces and Wired pieces and New York Times pieces about exactly this, the idea that the Taliban are basically quite active on social media. Um, and so what we saw in the aftermath actually was that they were trying, I think they saw that there was more eyes on them by the international community. So there's actually a bit of a switch. And so I think last year, so International Women's Day of 2022, they were talking about how great it was that they had a singular, I mean, they didn't highlight it as the singular woman, but that they had a woman as like a hospital administrator in one of the hospitals in like a key province. And so I think they were trying to do that positioning or that dance for a little bit that no, actually, we're gonna be really fair to women. And then I think over the last few months, that's sort of shifted yet again. And I think I highlighted this earlier around, Taliban members, joining in that Twitter space or like Twitter Live about Andrew Tate, and sort of this regression to talking about women in that way. And then on sort of negotiations, definitely they were tweeting about it. There was specific spokesperson, like there's at least one account that's in the data set that was part of those negotiations in Doha. So he was talking about it quite a bit. So there's definitely sort of, they use that. It's unclear to me that they have really like a great articulated strategy on how to capitalize on those like key political events and like push out great like information campaigning around it. But they certainly were talking about it, and a lot of it, at least I would say there's like categories within the core account. Some are again quite professionalized accounts where they're like, I'm a spokesperson, this is my specific position, and they'll put out a combination of like personal opinions and also like more what look like official statements. And so around those negotiations, it was a lot of more kind of official statements rather than off the cuff remarks about it.
Oh,
Yeah, I just want to buck up Steve and Herb here in supporting Harold. So this is sort of more of a comment, but from my standpoint, from the legal standpoint, I'm struck by just a couple of things, and it occurs to me like you should hang out with a lawyer, and I might even know a guy. But one is, on the counter strategy point, I mean, there are really interesting questions about like, well, what can the U.S. government say or do to a private company about what information it has on its website? It can designate an entity as a terrorist organization, but can it say like, hey, you should be doing better fact checking? Really interesting questions, again, about appropriate role of government in this kind of soft effort to regulate social media companies. Second, on the recognition point, right? The United States still has not recognized the Taliban. I mean, we have recognized Afghanistan as a country for a long time. The separate question is, who do we recognize as the government of Afghanistan? And to this day, the United States does not recognize the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. So I don't know if that's also relevant in terms of the policies that social media companies apply when they're trying to think about like, who are we going to think about as a government of a state? Thanks.
Yep, those are two. Yeah, definitely agree with those comments. Would love to chat more with someone that has like a legal background because, yeah.
okay. I think that's it.
Great.
Let's thank our
Thank you so much.